The Cathar Empire dominated the outer spiral of the galaxy with cold precision. Their warships, sleek, angular vessels of gleaming obsidian, moved through space like predatory fish, hunting for any sign of Earth Alliance vessels. The Cathar valued discipline above all else, their society built upon rigid hierarchy and military efficiency. For generations, they had regarded humans as weak, undisciplined creatures whose technology was primitive and whose bodies were fragile. Captain Archon stood on the command deck of his patrol vessel. The fist of Cathar, his tall, grayscaled form perfectly still as he studied the tactical display. His reputation for rigid adherence to protocol had earned him this border patrol command. Not the most prestigious position, but one that suited his methodical nature. The border regions had seen increased Earth Alliance activity in recent months, and High Command expected results. Captain, his tactical officer called, breaking the silence. We're detecting a small Alliance vessel on an unusual trajectory. Signature matches a medical transport. Var's amber eyes narrowed. A medical transport this deep in contested space? Unlikely. More probably a spy vessel with falsified signatures. It's broadcasting standard medical protocols, sir. Designation Nightingale. Perfect cover for intelligence gathering, Var replied dismissively. Move to intercept. Prepare boarding parties. The battle was brief and one-sided. The Nightingale, despite its evasive maneuvers, was no match for the Cathar warship. Precision strikes disabled its engines and communication array, leaving it drifting helplessly. Var watched with satisfaction as his gunners systematically eliminated the vessel's defensive capabilities without destroying it. High Command would reward intelligence capture far more than a simple kill. Boarding teams ready, Captain, his second-in-command reported. Proceed, Var ordered. Capture any survivors for interrogation. Download their databases before they could be wiped. The boarding party, led by Var himself, cut through the airlock and entered the crippled Earth vessel. The interior was chaos. Emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow, and the air was thick with smoke and the scent of burned circuitry. Most of the crew they encountered were already dead, their bodies thrown against bulkheads by explosive decompression or cut down in brief firefights. Spread out, Var ordered his team. Search every compartment. Lieutenant Krev, one of his most trusted officers, signaled from corridor. Captain, we found the medical bay. There's someone still alive. The medical bay was in disarray, supplies scattered across the floor, monitoring equipment blaring urgent warnings. In the center of the chaos stood a human female in a blood-spattered medical uniform, frantically working over the body of a grievously wounded Alliance soldier. She didn't even look up as the Cathar soldiers entered with weapons raised. Step away from the patient, Var commanded in the human trade language. The woman continued working, her hands moving with practiced precision as she administered injections and sealed bleeding wounds. Can't, she replied tersely. He'll die if I stop. Var moved closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her work. That is irrelevant. You are now prisoners of the Cathar Empire. Step away, or we will remove you by force. For the first time, she looked up, and Var was struck by the intensity in her eyes. Not fear, but a calm, focused determination. My name is Lieutenant Ilera Vance, Chief Medical Officer of the Alliance vessel Nightingale. This man has 3 minutes before brain death if I don't stabilize him. Shoot me if you must, but let me finish first. Something in her demeanor, the absolute conviction in her voice, gave Var pause. Before he could respond, an alarm blared from a nearby console. Coolant leak detected in adjacent compartment. One of his soldiers reported, checking readings on his wrist device. Toxic to Cathar physiology. Var felt the first burning sensation in his lungs as the invisible gas began to seep through the ventilation system. His soldiers began to cough, their scaled skin taking on a sickly pallor. The human medic glanced at the warning display, then at the struggling Cathar. Your respiratory systems can't handle tetrafluoride exposure, she said quickly, abandoning her patient and moving toward a supply cabinet. You have minutes before permanent damage occurs. What are you doing? Var demanded, his voice already rough with irritation in his throat. "Saving your lives?" she replied, pulling out several vials and a nebulizer. With quick, practiced movements, she mixed compounds and activated the device. "Breathe this in. It will neutralize the gas in your lungs and prevent tissue damage." Var hesitated, suspicion warring with increasing discomfort. The human could be trying to poison them further. "If I wanted you dead," she said, reading his thoughts, "I'd just let the coolant do its work." "Make your choice, Captain." One of his soldiers had collapsed to his knees, gasping. Var made his decision, took the nebulizer, and breathed in the medicated mist. The relief was almost immediate, the burning sensation receding. He passed the device to his struggling soldiers, watching as they, too, recovered. By the time they had all been treated, Vance had returned to her original patient, continuing her work as if nothing had happened. "You could have escaped while we were incapacitated," Var noted, studying her with new interest. "To where?" she replied without looking up. "Besides, I took an oath to preserve life. All life." She finished applying a sealant to her patient's chest wound and stepped back, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. "He's stable. For now," Var signaled to his soldiers, who moved forward to secure both the medic and her patient. "Lieutenant Ilera Vance," he said formally, "you and any surviving crew are now prisoners of the Cthar Empire." She met his gaze evenly. "And what about my patients?" "Patient," Var corrected, "and his fate depends on his value for intelligence." Later, as they returned to the Fist of Cthar with their prisoners and gathered data, Var composed his report to High Command. He hesitated when describing the human medic, finally writing, "Among the captives is a medical officer of unusual skill and initiative. Recommend specialized interrogation to extract potentially valuable medical knowledge. Subject demonstrates characteristics of potential use to the Empire." The prison facility on Lunar Outpost K-17 was a bleak structure of metal and stone, carved into the face of a tidally locked moon orbiting a gas giant. Inside its walls, the temperature was kept deliberately cool, uncomfortable for humans, but optimal for Cthar metabolism. Lieutenant Ilera Vance had been there for 3 weeks, isolated in a small cell when not being interrogated about Alliance medical technology and protocols. Chief Scientist Zyler, the facility's director, was growing increasingly frustrated. "The human refuses to cooperate fully," he reported to Captain Var, who had been reassigned to security oversight at the facility following the Nightingale capture. "She provides basic medical information that any first-year cadet would know, but withholds anything of strategic value." Var studied the surveillance feed, showing Vance sitting calmly in her cell, despite the cold that must have been causing her considerable discomfort. "Has physical coercion been attempted?" "Of course," Zyla replied with a dismissive gesture. "She endures it stoically. More importantly, such methods risk damaging a potentially valuable asset. High Command is interested in her medical knowledge, not breaking her." Var considered this. Perhaps a different approach. Allow her to practice her skills in a controlled environment. Observe what she does naturally rather than forcing information from her. Zyler's facial ridges contracted skeptically. "You suggest giving a prisoner access to medical supplies? Potential weapons?" "Under strict supervision," Var clarified. "Assign her to treat minor injuries among the human prisoners first, then perhaps some of our lower-rank personnel with non-critical conditions. Nothing that could compromise security, but enough to assess her true capabilities." The experiment began the next day. Vance was escorted to a makeshift medical bay established in one of the prison blocks. She was given basic supplies and presented with 3 human prisoners suffering from various ailments. One with a respiratory infection, another with an infected wound, and a third with symptoms of malnutrition. Var watched through surveillance as she examined each patient methodically, showing a gentleness that seemed at odds with her determined efficiency. She spoke to each one, not just about their symptoms, but asking about their comfort, their mental state. This behavior puzzled Var. In Cthar medicine, such considerations were irrelevant. Efficiency was all that mattered. Individual comfort was never a priority. Over the following days, Vance's patients showed remarkable improvement. Even more surprising was her request to see them again after they had been returned to their cells, explaining that follow-up care was essential to proper treatment. Such a concept was foreign to Cathar medical practice, where resources were allocated based solely on a patient's strategic value, not on ongoing care for already treated conditions. Fascinating methodology, Zeiler admitted reluctantly after reviewing the recovery rates. The human approach seems inefficient on the surface, expending additional resources on already treated subjects, but the long-term outcomes show higher recovery rates and fewer complications. Var nodded. Perhaps we should proceed to the next phase. Allow her to treat some of our personnel. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A catastrophic accident in the biological weapons research wing resulted in multiple casualties among high-ranking Cathar scientists and guards. The base's medical team was overwhelmed, particularly as the nature of the injuries, exposure to a modified nerve agent, was proving resistant to standard Cathar treatments. Var, making a decision that would later be scrutinized by his superiors, ordered Vance brought to the main medical facility. Your expertise is required, he told her bluntly, leading her past rows of convulsing Cathar personnel. These officers have been exposed to a neurological agent that our physicians cannot counteract. Vance took in the scene quickly, her expression shifting from surprise to focused determination. I need to know the exact composition of the agent, she said, already moving toward the nearest patient. That information is classified. Zeiler, who was overseeing the treatment efforts, objected. Then these people will die, Vance replied flatly. I can't create an antidote without knowing what I'm fighting. After a tense standoff, Zeiler reluctantly provided access to the agent specifications. Vance studied them briefly, then began issuing requests for specific compounds and equipment. Her confidence was so absolute that even the Cathar medical staff found themselves following her directions without question. The agent targets acetylcholine receptors, she explained as she worked, mixing compounds with practiced precision. But Cathar neurochemistry uses a different neurotransmitter analog. I need to modify this human antidote to bind with your receptors instead. For 6 hours straight, Vance worked without rest, moving from patient to patient, administering her improvised treatment and adjusting the formula based on results. By the end of that time, the convulsions had stopped in most patients and the death rate had plateaued. Among those she saved was Subcommander Thel, a cousin of the regional governor. When the governor arrived to inspect the damage to his research facility, he was astounded to find his relative alive and recovering. This human did this? He asked Var, watching as Vance, exhausted but still focused, checked the vital signs of another recovering officer. Yes, Governor. Without our intervention, our casualties would have been total. The governor studied the human with newfound interest. Perhaps High Command has underestimated the practical value of Earth medical knowledge. I will include this in my report. As Vance was escorted back to her cell after the crisis, Var found himself walking alongside her rather than behind as protocol dictated. Your actions today were unexpected, he said finally. She glanced at him, fatigue evident in her features. Why? Because I helped the enemy? Because protocol would dictate that prisoners not be given such access or authority, regardless of circumstances. Is that what your protocol would have you do? Let your people die when I could save them? Var had no immediate answer. The question probed at something uncomfortable in his understanding of duty and protocol. Efficiency and strategic value are the pillars of Cathar decision-making, he said finally, reciting the principle that had guided his career. And what was the strategic value of those scientists? Hi, I guess. So by your own metrics, using my skills was the efficient choice. She stopped at the entrance to her cell block. But that's not why I did it. I did it because they were suffering and I could help. That's the only calculation that matters in my profession. Var watched her being led away, her words echoing uncomfortably in his mind. For the first time in his career, he found himself questioning the rigid principles that had always guided him. Over the following weeks, rumors spread throughout the facility about the human healer. Lower-ranking Cathar personnel, normally treated as disposable assets by the medical division, began finding excuses to pass by the section where Vance was now permitted to operate a small clinic for minor ailments. Some even deliberately incurred minor injuries to experience her treatment firsthand. What fascinated them wasn't just her medical skill, but her approach, the way she treated each patient as worthy of care, regardless of rank or strategic importance. In a society where one's value was determined solely by usefulness to the empire, this radical egalitarianism was both alien and strangely compelling. Var, observing this growing phenomenon, found himself caught between duty and a growing awareness that something significant was happening, something that might be either an opportunity or a threat to the empire he had served unquestioningly his entire life. Kthar High Command, initially skeptical of reports from Outpost K-17, began to take notice when efficiency metrics from the facility showed a marked improvement. Injury recovery times decreased, return to duty rates increased, and even morale indicators, normally ignored as irrelevant by Kthar leadership, showed positive trends. The human medic experiment has produced unexpected dividends, Subcommander Raxus noted during a secure communication with the facility leadership. High Command has authorized expanded utilization of the asset. She is to be transferred to Forward Medical Station V9, near the Arcturus front. Xyler protested immediately. Moving her closer to active combat zones increases escape risk substantially. The intelligence value has been reassessed, Raxus interrupted. Her current applications provide more immediate value than potential information extraction. Captain Var will continue security oversight during the transfer and at the new facility. Var, present for the communication, kept his expression neutral despite his surprise at being included in the reassignment. Was it recognition of his effective management, or suspicion of his increasingly complex attitude toward the human medic? Either possibility was troubling. For Medical Station V9 was a very different environment from the prison facility. Located on an asteroid base just behind the front lines of the ongoing Kthar offensive against Alliance forces, it was chaotic, overcrowded, and constantly receiving new casualties from the battlefield. When Vance arrived, escorted by Var and a security detail, the station's chief medical officer, Dr. Krell, greeted them with barely concealed contempt. "I was told to expect you, human," he said, his tall frame looming over her. "Let me be clear. You will follow our protocols exactly. Kthar medicine has functioned effectively for centuries without human interference." Vance surveyed the medical bay behind him, where dozens of wounded Kthar soldiers lay on treatment platforms. Many have been categorized with colored tags: green for minor injuries, yellow for serious but non-critical, red for priority treatment, and black for those deemed too severely wounded to merit resource expenditure. "You're triaging based on rank, not survival probability," she observed, nodding toward a black-tagged junior soldier with extensive but potentially treatable burns, while a red-tagged officer with similar injuries was receiving immediate attention. "Resources are allocated according to strategic value," Krell replied stiffly. "That is protocol." "That protocol is wasting lives and expertise," Vance countered. "Every trained soldier represents an investment of resources. Discarding them prematurely is inefficient." The word inefficient caused Krell to bristle. In Kthar culture, few accusations were more serious. "You will observe our methods and assist only as directed," he said coldly, turning away. Var, witnessing the exchange, said nothing. But he noted how Vance's gaze lingered on the black-tagged soldiers as she was led to her assigned station. It took less than a day for Vance to break protocol. During a massive influx of casualties following a major battle, she abandoned her assigned post treating minor injuries and moved to assist with critical cases. Before Krell or the security detail could intervene, she had already retagged several black-coated soldiers and begun emergency procedures on a young Kthar warrior with a severe chest wound. "Stop immediately," Krell demanded, moving to intercept her. "He has a tension pneumothorax," Vance explained rapidly, not looking up as she prepared a needle decompression. "Simple to treat if caught in time. Fatal if ignored. That soldier is coated black." Resources have been allocated elsewhere. The procedure takes 30 seconds and requires one instrument, she replied, already inserting the needle. A hiss of escaping air followed, and the soldier's labored breathing immediately eased. There. Now he's yellow code, not black. 30 seconds well spent. Krell was furious, but the results were difficult to argue with. The soldier, who would have died within minutes, was now stable enough for secondary treatment. More troublingly for Kthar protocol, several medical technicians had witnessed the exchange and the effectiveness of Vance's intervention. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Vance would follow protocol to the letter when under direct observation, but during chaotic periods or night shifts, she would implement her own triage system based on survival probability rather than rank. More and more black tag soldiers found themselves reclassified and treated. Var, whose duty was to prevent exactly this kind of subversion, found himself increasingly conflicted. The efficiency metrics, the only measure that would matter to high command, were undeniably improving. More soldiers were returning to duty. Fewer resources were being wasted on hopeless cases. By the Empire's own standards, Vance's methods were superior. But the ideological contamination was becoming evident. Medical staff who worked alongside Vance began adopting some of her techniques, first in secret, then more openly as results proved their value. More disturbingly, they began to exhibit behaviors that mirrored her approach, showing concern for individual patients, following up on treatments, even occasionally questioning the traditional rank-based resource allocation. She is changing them, Var noted in his private log one night. Not through rebellion or force, but through demonstration. They see the results and cannot unsee them. Is this how empires fall? Not from external conquest, but from ideas that spread like contagions. The breaking point came during the aftermath of the Battle of Nexus Point. A Kthar strike force, having successfully destroyed an Alliance outpost, was conducting a strategic withdrawal when they encountered unexpected resistance. Several dropships were damaged, forcing emergency landings on a contested moon. Standard protocol for such situations was clear. Retrieve any officers and abandon lower-rank casualties if retrieval would endanger the mission. But one squad, led by Sergeant Drav, defied those orders. Drav and his team remained behind under heavy fire to extract wounded comrades, explicitly citing medical viability regardless of rank as their justification, words straight from Vance's teachings. When the incident report reached high command, the response was immediate and severe. The ideological contamination was deemed a critical threat to Kthar military discipline. Vance was reclassified from valuable asset to dangerous subversive. Orders were issued for her immediate isolation and eventual termination once all useful knowledge had been extracted. Var was summoned to a secure communication with High Command. The face on the screen belonged to Commander Soth, head of internal security, a deeply troubling sign. Captain Var, your reports on a human medic have been reviewed in detail. Soth began without preamble. They show a disturbing lack of concern regarding her influence on personnel. The efficiency metrics, Var began, are irrelevant if the cost is subversion of our fundamental principles. Soth cut him off. Your judgment has been compromised, Captain, perhaps by exposure to these human ideas, perhaps by something more personal. Either way, you are relieved of your security oversight position. Var stiffened. Sir, I have served with absolute loyalty, which is why you're being given a chance to redeem yourself rather than facing immediate court-martial. Soth continued coldly. The human has escaped. Var's surprise was genuine. Escaped? How? With assistance from compromised medical personnel during the chaos following the Nexus Point battle. She has gone aground somewhere in the frontal zone. Healer alive. One intercepted communication noted ironically. Not because she kills, but because she saves those we would discard, and in doing so, reveals the flaws in our most fundamental beliefs. Var's pursuit took him through the aftermath of battles, hospital ships, field aid stations, and abandoned outposts. At each location, he gathered intelligence while concealing his true mission from local commanders who might have been compromised. The trail led eventually to a remote moon in the Tarsus system, where intelligence suggested Vance had established a more permanent medical facility in the ruins of an abandoned mining outpost. As Var's team approached in stealth shuttles, he prepared himself for the confrontation to come. He had rehearsed what he would say, the charges he would lay out, the justification for the execution order. Yet doubt gnawed at him with each passing moment. Was he preserving the Empire by eliminating a subversive, or was he destroying someone who had exposed truths too uncomfortable to acknowledge? The facility was well hidden in a canyon network, with sophisticated sensor jammers that explained how it had remained undetected for so long. Var's team breached the perimeter without resistance. There were no guards, no defenses. Just medical equipment, supplies, and wounded from both sides being treated side by side. In the central treatment area, Ilara Vance was performing surgery on a Cathar soldier with a severe spinal injury. She didn't look up as Var entered with his weapon drawn, flanked by his strike team. "Lieutenant Ilara Vance," he announced formally, "by order of Cathar High Command, you are condemned for subversion, escape, and ideological terrorism against the Empire." She continued working, her hands steady as she aligned bone fragments along the Cathar's spine. "I'll be with you in a moment, Captain Var," she replied calmly. "Unless you prefer I leave this soldier paralyzed." The soldier on the table, conscious but immobilized, fixed his gaze on Var. It was Sergeant Drav, the very officer whose defiance of protocol had precipitated the current crisis. "She is healing our warriors when our own doctors abandon them," Drav said, his voice strained. "How is this terrorism, Captain?" Var signaled for his team to secure the facility and locate any other personnel. As they moved to comply, he noticed something troubling: hesitation in some of his soldiers, particularly those who had served with him at the medical station. They followed orders, but their movements lacked conviction. "Your influence spreads like a disease," Var told Vance as she continued the delicate procedure. "You undermine the very foundations of our society. Hierarchy, discipline, efficiency. These are what make the Cathar strong." "Are they?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "From what I've seen, they make you brittle. You discard your wounded instead of healing them. You waste lives based on arbitrary rank. You call it efficiency, but it's really just callousness dressed up as strategy. Our ways have sustained our empire for millennia and led you into endless wars," she countered, finally finishing the procedure and stepping back from the surgical table. She met Var's gaze directly, unafraid despite the weapon pointed at her. "The real strength of a civilization isn't in how willing it is to sacrifice its people, but in how it preserves and values them." Around them, Var became aware of movement. His soldiers had returned, but they weren't alone. Medical staff, patients able to walk, even some Alliance prisoners stood in doorways and corridors, watching the confrontation. More disturbingly, his own strike team had formed a loose perimeter that included both him and Vance, rather than surrounding her as their target. "Your soldiers won't fire on unarmed medical personnel," Vance said quietly. "Some of them are my patients once. Others have friends or squad mates who would be dead without the treatments I've developed." She gestured around the facility. "This isn't a rebellion, Var. It's a hospital. The only enemy here is suffering." Var felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, Cathar and human alike, united in silent judgment of his next action. His hand tightened on his weapon, then loosened. "High Command will send others if I fail," he said, his voice low. "They will not be as compromised as I apparently am." "Then don't fail," she replied. "Succeed differently." For several long moments, Var stood frozen in indecision. Everything in his training, his lifetime of Cathar discipline, demanded that he complete his mission. But the evidence before him, the lives saved, the loyal soldiers who would rather defy orders than allow this healing place to be destroyed, spoke to a different kind of truth. Finally, he lowered his weapon and activated his communication device, not to his strike team, but on a secure frequency used only by the highest echelons of command. "Commander Soth," he said formally when the connection established, "I have located the human subversive." Vance tensed, but didn't run. Around them, The gathered witnesses watched in tense silence. "Report your status, Captain." Soth's voice crackled through the device. "Has the target been eliminated?" "The situation is more complex than initially reported," Var replied carefully. "I request consultation with Moderator Thel of the Central Policy Directorate." There was a long pause. Moderator Thel was known as a voice for policy reform within High Command. Not a revolutionary, but a pragmatist who had questioned the sustainability of perpetual warfare. Var's request was tantamount to declaring political allegiance in a highly charged moment. "Explain yourself, Captain," Soth demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. "I believe I have discovered an opportunity to resolve several strategic challenges simultaneously," Var replied, choosing his words with extreme care. "The human's medical innovations have significant military applications that were not fully evaluated. Additionally, I have uncovered a potential channel for unofficial communication with Alliance Command that could be leveraged for tactical advantage." It wasn't exactly a lie. Vance's techniques did have military applications, and her connection to both sides did create a potential communication channel. Var was simply recasting the narrative in terms High Command might accept, buying time for a different approach. "Stand by for further instructions," Soth said finally. "Maintain containment of the target. Moderator Thel will be consulted." The connection terminated, leaving Var and Vance facing each other in a moment of uncertain truce. "What just happened?" she asked quietly. "I've created a possibility," Var replied. "It's tenuous at best, but there are factions within High Command who have been advocating for a reassessment of our perpetual war footing. Your methods provide evidence that alternatives exist to our traditional approaches." "You're risking everything," she observed. "Your career, possibly your life." "As are you," he countered. "We appear to have that in common, at least." The next 12 hours were among the most tense of Var's life. His strike team secured the perimeter of the facility, but made no move against the personnel inside. Vance continued treating patients, including some of Var's own soldiers who had minor injuries or ailments. The bizarre normality of it all, enemies coexisting in this small pocket of neutrality, was both unsettling and oddly compelling. Finally, his communication device activated again. The voice that came through belonged not to Commander Soth, but to Moderator Thel himself. "Captain Var, your situation has been reviewed at the highest levels," Thel began, his tone carefully neutral. "Your request for consultation has been interpreted as a field initiative to explore alternative strategic approaches. A local ceasefire has been authorized for a 15-kilometer radius around your position for a period of 30 standard days. During this time, you will document all medical procedures and outcomes at the facility, with particular attention to recovery rates and return-to-duty statistics." Var could hardly believe what he was hearing. A ceasefire, even a local, temporary one, was unprecedented in the decades-long conflict. "You will retain nominal command of the zone," Thel continued, "and the human medic will operate under your authority. Any Alliance personnel in the zone are to be treated as non-combatants for the duration, provided they maintain the ceasefire on their side. This is categorized as a strategic assessment operation, not a political initiative. Is that clear, Captain?" "Perfectly clear, Moderator," Var replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Thank you for your confidence." "Don't mistake this for confidence, Captain," Thel replied dryly. "This is an experiment with very powerful opponents. If it fails, neither of us will survive the consequences." Fell out. Var lowered the device slowly, meeting Vance's questioning gaze. "We have 30 days," he said simply. 30 days to prove that your way works better than ours." News of the Tarsus neutral zone spread rapidly through both Cthar and Alliance forces. Initial reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage to cautious hope. Many commanders on both sides protested vigorously, seeing it as either a trap or a dangerous precedent. But the ceasefire held, protected by Moderator Thel's authority on the Cthar side and by Alliance commanders who recognized the unprecedented opportunity it presented. The neutral zone quickly evolved into something neither side had anticipated. What had begun as a single medical facility expanded as wounded from both armies were brought to the zone for treatment. Additional structures were erected supply lines established, and medical personnel from both sides cautiously began to work together under Vance's coordination. Var found himself in the strange position of administering what amounted to a small, independent territory. He established clear guidelines: no weapons within the central areas, no intelligence gathering, no communication of tactical information back to either side. The zone existed for one purpose only: healing. The data they collected was compelling. Recovery rates exceeded both Cthar and Alliance standards. Return-to-duty times shortened. Perhaps most significantly, the psychological impact on troops who received treatment in the zone was profound. Many reported increased morale and mission commitment, rather than the diminished combat effectiveness that Cthar High Command had feared. They fight better because they know they'll be treated if wounded, regardless of rank, Vance explained to Var as they reviewed the statistics. Security doesn't come from fear of failure. It comes from confidence in support. As the 30-day deadline approached, similar initiatives began to appear elsewhere along the front. Small, unofficial zones where local commanders established brief truces for medical evacuations or treatment of the wounded. None were officially sanctioned like the Tarsus zone, but the pattern was clear. The idea was spreading. On the final day of the authorized ceasefire, Moderator Thel arrived personally at the Tarsus facility, accompanied by a delegation that included both military officers and civil administrators. His presence sent shockwaves through the zone. Such a high-ranking official rarely ventured to frontline areas. "I needed to see this phenomenon with my own eyes," he told Var as they walked through the main treatment center, observing Cthar and human medical staff working side by side. The reports seemed improbable. "The results speak for themselves, Moderator," Var replied, presenting the meticulously compiled data on a tablet. "Effectiveness metrics exceed standard protocols by significant margins." "Effectiveness is not the only consideration," Thel noted, his voice low. "There are powerful factions in high command who view this entire experiment as dangerous heresy. Commander Soth has been particularly vocal about the need to immediately terminate the zone and everyone in it, including you, Captain." Var maintained his composure despite the blunt threat. "In your position, Moderator?" Thel stopped walking, turning to face Var directly. "My position is that the Empire has been fighting this war for 3 generations with nothing to show for it, but casualties and resource depletion. If there are more efficient approaches, even ones that challenge our traditional beliefs, they merit consideration." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at one of the surgical bays. A Cthar soldier had been brought in with severe plasma burns covering most of his body, injuries that would traditionally earn an immediate black tag under Cthar protocol. Vance was already moving, calling for specific treatments and equipment. Thel watched with naked fascination as the medical team, a mix of human and Cthar personnel, worked seamlessly together, implementing techniques that combine technologies and approaches from both species. "She doesn't distinguish between your soldiers and hers," Thel observed. "Why?" "Because she sees no strategic value in unnecessary death," Var replied. "A perspective that is changing how I view many things." The ceasefire was extended, first for another 30 days, then for 3 months. Similar zones began to appear along other sections of the front, some officially sanctioned, others established through tacit agreement between local commanders. The war continued beyond these isolated pockets of cooperation, but its character was changing subtly, almost imperceptibly. High-level communication channels opened between moderates on both sides, using the medical zones as neutral meeting grounds. What began as discussions about prisoner exchanges and wounded evacuation protocols gradually expanded to include broader tactical de-escalation measures and even limited resource-sharing agreements. Commander Soth and his faction fought against what they termed contamination of Cthar values at every step. Several medical zones were forcibly shut down. Officers believed to be sympathetic to the new approach were reassigned to distant postings. But the momentum proved difficult to contain entirely. 2 years after Alara Vance's capture aboard the Nightingale, representatives from the Cthar Empire and the Earth Alliance met on neutral territory to sign the Arcturus Accords. Not a full peace treaty, but the first formal ceasefire in the generations-long conflict. The document established permanent neutral zones, protocols for non-aggression, and frameworks for potential future cooperation. The signing ceremony was broadcast throughout both territories. Standing in the background, deliberately positioned away from the political leaders who claimed credit for the breakthrough, were Vance and Var, the unlikely partnership that had demonstrated an alternative was possible. "They'll try to erase our role in this," Vance murmured as they watched the officials exchange formal gestures of non-aggression. "Politicians always rewrite history to their advantage." "Does that matter?" Var asked. "The outcome is what's important, not who receives recognition." Vance smiled slightly. "You're beginning to sound like a medic, Captain." "A disturbing thought," he replied, but there was no malice in his tone. The ceasefire held, despite numerous violations and provocations from hardliners on both sides. Over the following years, it gradually solidified into a fragile peace. The Cathar Empire, forced to look inward without the constant focus of war, began a slow but profound transformation. Questions that had been suppressed for generations about the rigid hierarchy and value systems began to be asked openly, particularly among younger Cathar who had experienced the neutral zones firsthand. Alara Vance, once branded the most dangerous subversive in Cathar territory, became the co-founder of the Interspecies Medical Institute, an organization dedicated to combining the medical knowledge of both civilizations. The facility, built at the original site of the Tarsus Neutral Zone, became a symbol of how former enemies could create something valuable together. Var, following a formal inquiry into his actions during the crisis, was absolved of charges of dereliction due to the ultimate strategic benefits that resulted from the peace process. Rather than returning to military service, he chose retirement, declining the numerous political positions offered to him. He retreated to a small estate on the Cathar homeworld, where he occasionally sent anonymous scholarly articles to medical and military journals, analyzing the ethical frameworks of both societies and proposing new hybrid approaches. On the 5th anniversary of the Arcturus Accords, Vance received an unexpected visitor at the Institute. Var, whom she hadn't seen in person since the signing ceremony, arrived without announcement or entourage. "Captain," she greeted him with genuine warmth. "Or should I say professor now? I've read your articles, even if no one is supposed to know you're the author." "Former captain," he corrected her. "Just Archon now." He glanced around at the facility, which had grown substantially since its modest beginnings. "You've built something remarkable here." "We built it," she corrected. "None of this would exist without the choice you made that day." They walked through the grounds of the Institute, where young medical students from both species trained together and research teams collaborated on solving medical challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. "I never asked you," Var said as they reached the memorial that had been erected to commemorate those who had died in the conflict, "why you didn't attempt escape when you had the chance back on the Nightingale. You risked everything to save enemies who had just killed your companions." Vance considered the question for a moment. "Because that's not how healing works," she said finally. "You don't get to choose who deserves it. The moment you start making those distinctions, you're no longer a healer. You're something else entirely." "A simple philosophy that nearly toppled an empire," Var observed. "Not toppled," she corrected. "Transformed. There's a difference." She smiled at a group of young Cathar students passing by, who nodded respectfully to them both. "The strongest civilizations aren't those that never change. They're the ones that can adapt without losing their core identity." "And what is our core identity now, I wonder?" Var mused. "Not quite Cathar as we once defined it. Not human either. Something new," Vance suggested. "Something that preserves the best aspects of both, while discarding what didn't serve us." As they continued their walk through the institute that embodied this philosophy, neither of them mentioned the reports of new tensions in distant sectors, or the rumors of hardliners on both sides rearming in secret. They were realistic enough to know that peace was always a fragile thing, requiring constant maintenance and renewal. But they had demonstrated an essential truth that could not be unlearned. That change could come not through destruction, but through healing. That the most feared individual in a conflict might be not the one who killed most efficiently, but the one who saved lives most compassionately, and that empires could be transformed not by conquest, but by the gradual, persistent spread of a simple, powerful idea that all life had value. In the decades that followed, as the precarious peace weathered numerous challenges and slowly evolved into genuine cooperation, historians would debate the precise moment when the tide turned in the generations-long conflict. Political analysts pointed to diplomatic breakthroughs, military experts cited strategic stalemates, economists emphasized resource depletion. But among the veterans of both sides who had experienced the neutral zones firsthand, there was little debate. The war had begun to end the moment a human medic, surrounded by enemies, had chosen to save rather than harm, and when a Cathar officer, bound by lifetime indoctrination, had found the courage to question what he had always been taught. They had become legends in their lifetimes, though neither sought such status. To some hardliners, Vance remained the most feared healer alive, the subversive who had undermined an empire not with weapons, but with compassion. To the new generation, she and Var represented what was possible when ancient hatreds gave way to the simple recognition of shared dignity. "I would have killed you that day if I'd been a better Cathar," Var admitted during one of their infrequent but meaningful reunions years later. "And I would have let your soldiers die from coolant exposure if I'd been a better human soldier," she replied with a wry smile. "Perhaps we both failed upward. To our glorious failures, then," he said, raising a glass in the human tradition he had come to appreciate. "And to what they created," she responded, completing the toast. The legacy they built outlasted them both, not in monuments or political structures, but in the transformed relationship between species that had once known only enmity. The most enduring victory, as Vance had once observed, was not the one achieved through superior firepower or strategic brilliance, but through the recognition that even in the darkest moments of conflict, healing remained possible for bodies, for minds, and ultimately for civilizations.